They said the old store in Riverbend was worthless, a broken place better left to time. But what if a forgotten door beneath its dusty floorboards held the stories of people who once fled danger and found hope? And what if a weary veteran named Daniel and his loyal German Shepherd Ranger were chosen to uncover a legacy of courage hidden for generations? When a powerful company tried to erase that history, the town had to decide what truly mattered: wealth or compassion, silence or truth. This story asks one simple question: what would you protect if the past reached out for your help?
Follow me closely
May
now.
this journey warm your heart
Entering the
and
original
remind you that
building.
light can rise even from forgotten
Follow the
places.
stairs.
Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The morning in the outskirts of Riverbend was covered with a thin mist that softened every shape and sound. The cold air carried the scent of damp soil and early autumn leaves. A pale sun struggled to rise behind the clouds, casting a dim light that made the landscape feel suspended between night and day. It was the kind of morning that looked quiet from the outside, but felt heavy for anyone carrying unseen burdens. Daniel Brooks stepped out from the small rented room he called home. At 40 years old, he had the build of a man shaped by hard labor and the silent discipline that came from years in the military. His shoulders were broad, but slightly hunched, as if the weight of memory rested there every moment. His dark hair was cropped short, sprinkled with strands of gray that appeared earlier than they should have. His face carried sharp edges, softened only by fatigue. A faint beard shadowed his jawline, and his eyes were a muted steel blue that rarely revealed emotion. Those eyes had watched too many things a man should not have to witness, and though he rarely spoke of the past, it lived inside him like an old wound that never fully closed. Daniel walked with quiet purpose toward the lumber mill where he worked. The path was familiar, a dirt road that cut through the tree line and led to a low wooden building marked by peeling paint and the constant smell of sawdust. It was not a place of comfort, but it was honest work, and he needed the stability. After years of serving overseas, he struggled to find a world that made sense. The mill gave him a routine, something steady enough to hold on to. Beside him trotted Ranger, a 5-year-old German Shepherd with a strong build and a coat of black and tan that gleamed even in weak morning light. Ranger moved with alert grace, ears pricked forward, tail relaxed, but ready. He had been Daniel's partner during the war, trained for search and rescue. Ranger had pulled Daniel from the rubble of a collapsed building after an explosion, and since that day, they had been bound by something deeper than command or duty. Ranger was fiercely loyal, protective, and unusually attentive to Daniel's moods. When Daniel's breath tightened with memories, Ranger would rest his head against Daniel's leg, as if anchoring him to the present. Daniel's co-workers at the mill greeted him each day with polite nods, but he kept to himself. Most of them were younger men with easy smiles and weekend plans, men who had not yet carried the heaviness Daniel bore. They respected him, but sensed the distance he placed around himself. It was not arrogance, it was survival. He had learned that silence was sometimes the only way to keep the past from rising. The day passed slowly, with the dull rhythm of work. Daniel moved boards, measured planks, cut and sanded rough timber until his palms burned. His hands were thick and scarred, each mark a small history of the battles he no longer spoke of. Ranger waited outside the mill, lying in the shade of an old pine tree, watching the entrance with patient loyalty. Every so often, Daniel stepped out to check on him, and Ranger lifted his head, eyes bright with recognition. Those brief moments steadied Daniel more than he admitted. By evening, exhaustion settled deep in Daniel's muscles. His wages were barely enough to cover rent and food, and money was a constant worry. He cooked simple meals, washed his clothes by hand, and stretched every dollar until it frayed. Yet he never complained. Hardship was something he understood. Hardship had shaped him. One afternoon, as Daniel finished stacking lumber, the mill foreman, a stout man with weathered features and a slow drawl, approached him with a letter. The foreman was not talkative, but he had a certain kindness. He handed Daniel the envelope and said it had arrived at the office earlier that day. Daniel wiped his hands on his work pants and opened it carefully. Inside was a formal notice written in plain, stiff wording. His grandfather, the last member of his family in Riverbend, had passed away. Daniel felt a faint pull in his chest, a mix of sadness and distance. He had not seen his grandfather in many years, yet he remembered the old man's rough laughter and strong hands. The letter continued. His grandfather had left him a property in Riverbend, a small general store that had once been the pride of the family but had long since fallen into disrepair. The words lingered in Daniel's mind. A general store. The building where he had once run through aisles as a child. The place where he had watched his grandfather greet every customer with warmth. The last doorway that connected him to a childhood untouched by war and loss. Ranger sensed the shift in Daniel's breath. He rose and pressed his side against Daniel's leg. Daniel rested a hand on Ranger's head. The touch steadied him enough to keep reading. The notice stated that the store belonged to him now. There were no details about its condition, only that he should contact the local office if he wished to claim it. Daniel folded the letter slowly, staring at the edges as if the paper held answers he had not yet found. He walked home in silence. The path felt different, heavier. Ranger stayed close, matching Daniel's pace with quiet certainty. Inside their small room, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, the letter on his knee. Memories flickered at the edges of his thoughts. The feel of cool wooden floors, the sound of the bell above the store door, the scent of old coffee and cinnamon candies, his grandfather's voice calling him by name. For a moment, Daniel felt the old ache of longing for a life that had slipped away. He wondered if returning to Riverbend would reopen wounds or offer relief. He wondered if he had the strength to face a place that held the ghosts of who he used to be. But he also felt something else, a thin thread of purpose pulling him forward. He was tired of drifting, tired of simply surviving, each day without direction. The store might be crumbling. It might be worthless. But it was the last piece of his family, the last part of a heritage he had lost too soon. Daniel looked at Ranger, who watched him with steady amber eyes. Ranger had followed him through fire and ruin. Ranger would follow him still. Daniel breathed in slowly, as if preparing for a march. The decision settled over him with quiet certainty. He would go to Riverbend. He would claim the store. Whatever waited for him there, he would face it. For the first time in months, he felt something close to purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was a road that belonged to him, and that was enough. The afternoon light in Riverbend was washed in a pale gold that made every flaw of the old store more visible. A cool breeze carried the scent of dust and fallen leaves across the street, brushing against the cracked walls and sagging roof of the building that now belonged to Daniel. The sky was clear but sharp. the kind of weather that revealed everything without mercy. Daniel stood before the store, with Ranger beside him. The building looked even worse up close than he remembered from childhood. The wooden boards had rotted in several places, leaving dark gaps that showed the emptiness inside. The windows were cloudy with grime, as if years of neglect had sealed them off from the world. The roof dipped unevenly, and the old sign that once carried the family name now hung at an angle, held by a single rusted nail. It felt like looking at a faded memory of someone he once loved. Daniel pushed the door open. The hinges groaned with a sound that echoed through the hollow interior. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper, mildew, and dust that had settled into every corner. Shelves leaned toward each other like tired men, and the counters wore deep scratches from decades of use. The place was a relic of a life long gone, and Daniel felt a faint ache in his chest as he walked across the creaking floor. He remembered being a boy, running through these aisles, while his grandfather laughed behind the counter. He remembered jars filled with candy, old tins of cocoa, and the bell above the door that chimed whenever a customer walked in. Now, the bell no longer worked, and the silence in the room felt heavy as stone. Ranger sniffed the floorboards with alert interest. His thick black and tan coat brushed against Daniel's leg as he moved. His ears flicked toward the faintest noises, and his eyes remained sharp. Ranger sensed Daniel's quiet struggle and stayed close, leaning his warm body into Daniel's side. The presence of the dog kept Daniel grounded, reminding him he was not facing this ruin alone. Outside, voices rose as a few townspeople strolled past. They glanced at the store and at Daniel with a mix of curiosity and resignation. One elderly man shook his head and muttered something about wasted potential. A woman with a narrow face and rough hands whispered that Daniel should sell the place before it collapsed entirely. Their tones carried no malice, only a tired acceptance that the store was beyond saving. They believed they were giving him good advice. Daniel stepped outside again, feeling the weight of their words settle on him. He understood their perspective. The store looked like a burden, not an opportunity, and he himself was barely making ends meet. Selling it would be the logical choice. The money could change his life. It could lift him out of years of struggle. It could give him a chance to finally breathe. But the thought of letting go of the last piece of his family tightened something in his chest. This was more than a building. It was the echo of the only place that had ever felt like home. As he stood there, with his thoughts circling heavily, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. It stood out sharply against the modest backdrop of Riverbend. The driver stepped out. He was a tall man with a lean build, dressed in a dark tailored suit that looked far too expensive for a quiet town. His hair was silver and perfectly combed, and his clean-shaven jawline gave him a cold and polished appearance. His eyes were a pale gray that held no warmth. This was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted without resistance. He approached Daniel with a smile that did not reach his eyes. This was Victor Hale, the director of Stone River Real Estate. His presence carried confidence sharpened by ambition, and his movements were deliberate, as if every gesture had been practiced before a mirror. Victor had built his reputation on buying land at low prices and flipping it into profitable developments. Compassion had no place in his work. His voice was smooth, but carried a slight undertone of impatience, which suggested he disliked wasting time on sentiment. Daniel greeted him with a guarded nod. Ranger stepped forward, positioning himself between Daniel and Victor. The dog's ears stood firmly, and a low rumble vibrated in his chest. Ranger did not trust this man, and Daniel felt the same instinct rising in him. Victor surveyed the old store with a brief glance, then turned his focus to Daniel. He spoke in a calm tone, explaining that Stone River was planning a major development project in Riverbend. The land where the store stood was crucial for the layout. He presented a check with an impressive sum written on it, enough to pull Daniel out of poverty and give him a new start. The offer struck Daniel like a blow. He had been struggling for so long that the idea of financial relief seemed almost unreal. A life without counting dollars. A life without rationing meals. A life with choices. But Victor's tone changed slightly as he spoke about the store. He called it outdated, worthless, a relic better removed than repaired. He dismissed the memories inside it and brushed aside the value of its history. His words were polished, but hollow, shaped only by profit. They cut into Daniel more deeply than he expected. Daniel felt an unease grow in him. Victor's smile was too sharp, his gaze too calculating. There was no respect for what the store represented, no acknowledgement of the time and love Daniel's grandfather had poured into it. Only the hunger for land and the assumption that Daniel would be desperate enough to surrender. Ranger reacted before Daniel could. The dog stepped closer, body tense, and gave a deep, quiet growl. Victor stiffened and took a small step back, the first crack in his polished composure. Daniel placed a calming hand on Ranger's shoulder, but understood the warning. Ranger sensed danger. Daniel felt it too. Victor regained his smooth manner and told Daniel he should think carefully. The store was falling apart. The money was generous. The sensible choice was obvious. Daniel looked at the building, then at the check, then at Ranger. A storm of thoughts churned in his mind. Logic told him to sell. His heart told him to hold on. And Victor's cold confidence only deepened Daniel's mistrust. He thanked Victor without committing to anything. The car drove away, leaving a faint chemical scent of expensive upholstery behind. As the sun lowered and shadows stretched across the broken storefront, Daniel felt the quiet shift inside him. The store was in ruins, and he was close to ruins himself. But he could not ignore the unease Victor left behind. Something about the offer felt wrong. Something about the man felt dangerous. Ranger pressed his head gently against Daniel's leg. Daniel placed a steady hand on the dog's neck. Together, they stood before the failing building, both sensing that a storm had begun to rise around them. The decision was not made yet. But Daniel knew one thing. This store was not going to be given up so easily. The late afternoon sky hung low over Riverbend, with a quiet grayness that softened every edge of the small town. A light chill settled in the air, carrying the scent of distant pine trees and old dust. Sunlight drifted through broken clouds in thin strips, casting muted bands of light across the wooden floor inside the store. The silence within the building felt deeper than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath. Daniel stood in the center of the room with sleeves rolled up and sweat forming at his temples. He had spent hours cleaning out the clutter left behind by time. Rotten boxes, stacks of forgotten papers, rusted jars, and pieces of fallen ceiling covered the floors. Every movement stirred a faint cloud of dust that drifted slowly in the pale light. Daniel worked with steady hands, but a heavy mind. Part of him questioned why he was trying to save this place at all. Another part felt a pull towards something he could not yet explain. Ranger stayed close as always. The 5-year-old German Shepherd moved with sharp alertness, his black and tan coat brushing against Daniel's legs whenever he passed. His ears stood high, turning with every creak of the old building. Ranger had been trained to detect danger, but what he sensed today was something else, something quieter, buried beneath wood and memory. Daniel bent down to lift an old crate. His palms burned with fatigue, yet he continued with determined focus. Hard work was familiar to him. It kept the mind steady. It kept the past at a distance. But no amount of labor could silence the unease Victor Hale had left behind. Victor's cold smile and dismissive tone still echoed in Daniel's thoughts. The man had seen no value in the store, no meaning in its history. That alone made Daniel cling to it even more. Ranger suddenly froze. His body stiffened and his ears shot forward. Daniel set the crate aside and watched as Ranger moved across the floor with slow precision. The dog lowered his nose, sniffing deeply at a single darkened plank near the back corner of the room. He pressed his paw against it, then scratched once, then again. The sound was sharp against the quiet room. Daniel wiped his hands on his pants and walked toward him. Ranger scratched harder. The dog's breathing quickened, and a soft growl formed low in his throat, not of aggression, but of insistence. He was urging Daniel to pay attention. Daniel knelt beside him and touched the board. The wood felt cooler than the rest of the floor. He pressed along the edge and felt a faint shift. The plank was loose. A subtle tremor of curiosity passed through him. Ranger backed up slightly, eyes fixed on Daniel with expectation. Daniel slid his fingers beneath the edge of the plank and lifted. Dust burst upward in a gray cloud as the wood came free. Beneath it lay a shallow hollow, dark and long, undisturbed. Within the small space rested a single envelope. Its paper had yellowed with time, and the edges curled inward like it had been waiting for years to be found. Daniel hesitated. His breath grew slower and deeper. He reached into the hollow and lifted the envelope with careful fingers. The paper felt fragile, almost as if it might crumble from the warmth of his hand. Yet the handwriting on the front was still clear enough for him to recognize it was his grandfather's writing. A wave of emotion tightened his chest. His grandfather had been a strong man with weathered skin and a voice full of warmth. Daniel remembered the man's gentle firmness, the way he guided customers with humor, the way he spoke to Daniel with patience. He had been the anchor of Daniel's early years before life tore them apart. Daniel opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter, written in that same steady hand. The ink was faded, but still legible. As he read the first line, a shiver moved through him. Value is not found on the surface. If you are reading this, it means what I guarded has chosen you. The words stilled him completely. Ranger sat beside him, ears still high, sensing the shift in Daniel's breath. Daniel read the line again, absorbing each word. There was no explanation, no details, only the suggestion that something deeper existed beneath the store, beneath the life his grandfather had allowed others to see. His pulse quickened. A knot of fear mixed with wonder tightened in his chest. He felt as if he had stepped toward the edge of something vast and hidden. He folded the letter slowly. His hands trembled, not from fatigue, but from a rising uncertainty. He had always believed his grandfather was a simple man who worked hard and cared deeply for those around him. But this message hinted at a truth far more complex. Had his grandfather carried a secret all those years? Had he guarded something Daniel had never imagined? The thought unsettled Daniel, yet also awakened something long dormant in him. Ranger nudged Daniel's arm gently. The dog's warm presence anchored him again. Daniel rested a hand on Ranger's neck, grounding himself through the steady heartbeat beneath the thick coat. For a long moment, Daniel sat in silence. His thoughts churned with quiet intensity. He felt the pull of fear, the kind that whispered of unknown paths and hidden dangers. But curiosity rose beside it, stronger than he expected. The store had always felt like a shell of the past. Now it felt like a doorway, a threshold into something that touched both family and destiny. He looked at the hollow beneath the floorboards, then at the letter again. The words felt like an invitation and a responsibility. Value is not found on the surface. Daniel took a slow breath as Ranger leaned against his leg. Whatever his grandfather had hidden, it had waited for him. And now that he had found it, nothing in Riverbend would feel ordinary again. The night settled over Riverbend with a soft stillness. The air carried the scent of damp wood and the faint chill of approaching evening. Thin bands of moonlight slipped through cracks in the old store roof, leaving pale streaks on the dusty floor. A quiet hush filled the building, as if the world outside had faded away. Daniel stood near the corner of the room where Ranger had uncovered the loose floorboard. His hands were steady, but his breath carried a tightness he could not shake. The letter from his grandfather rested in his pocket, the words still echoing in his mind. Value is not found on the surface. The message left him restless, caught between fear and fascination. He sensed that whatever he was about to uncover would alter everything he believed about the store and about the man who had once run it. Ranger paced near him with controlled energy. The German shepherd's black and tan coat shimmered in the dim light. His ears stayed forward, alert to every sound. His steps were soft, almost cautious. Ranger had the instinct of a protector, forged through years of search and rescue work. Tonight that instinct guided him again. He sniffed along the floor, circling the same area as before, finally stopping near a seam Daniel had not noticed earlier. Daniel knelt beside him and brushed away a layer of dust. Beneath the grime, he felt a faint groove carved into the wood. He pressed his fingers along the line until he found the edge of a concealed hatch. His pulse quickened. He pushed his weight forward and lifted. The wood creaked as it opened, revealing a narrow passage that led downward into darkness. The air that drifted up was cool and stale. Daniel aimed the small flashlight he kept in his pocket into the opening. The beam cut through the darkness, but only revealed a narrow set of old wooden steps descending into a shadowed space. His heart thudded slowly, with both caution and curiosity. Ranger stood at the top of the opening, tail low but steady, waiting for Daniel to move. Daniel drew a slow breath, steadying his nerves. He descended each step with care, the wood groaning under his weight. The narrow passage opened into a wider room, and his flashlight washed over stone walls that looked far older than the store above. The floor was packed dirt, smooth from years of footsteps long vanished. It was a hidden chamber built with purpose. He swept the light across the room. Shelves lined the walls, holding stacks of papers wrapped in string. Books with cracked leather bindings and tin boxes rusted around the edges. He stepped closer, lifting a bundle of papers from the nearest shelf. The pages were fragile and yellowed by age. When he opened them, He saw letters written in a careful hand. Stories poured from the pages. People begging for safety. Families fleeing violence. Men and women who had crossed borders searching for hope they could not find elsewhere. Daniel placed the letter down with reverence. He reached for a small tin box and opened it. Inside were photographs, black and white, and worn at the corners. Faces of strangers looked back at him. A young mother holding a child. A man with tired eyes and a weathered face. A group of workers standing together in a narrow alley. Their expressions carried hardship and resilience. They were people whose names the world had forgotten. He moved farther into the chamber. A thick journal rested on a wooden table pushed against the far wall. When he opened it, the handwriting inside struck him with a jolt of recognition. It was his grandfather's hand. Page after page recorded the stories of those who had passed through this hidden place. Refugees escaping war. Laborers whose homes had been taken. Veterans who had returned from battle only to find themselves lost. All of them had come through the store above seeking safety, and his grandfather had given it without hesitation. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had always seen his grandfather as a kind man, but he had never understood the depth of that kindness. His grandfather had carried a quiet courage. He had stood in the shadows to shield people the world overlooked. He had built this chamber not for profit, not for recognition, but because he believed in protecting those who had nowhere else to go. Daniel closed the journal slowly. Emotion swelled within him. A mixture of grief and pride burned through him with steady heat. His grandfather had faced burdens without complaint. He had offered hope in silence, and he had kept this truth hidden from the world because he believed the acts themselves were enough. Ranger brushed against Daniel's leg, sensing the heaviness in his breath. Daniel placed a hand on the dog's strong neck. Ranger had rescued him in the past, but now Ranger had guided him to a different kind of salvation. The chamber revealed not only his grandfather's secret, but also a long thread of purpose that stretched through generations. Daniel walked across the room again, letting the flashlight illuminate each relic, every letter, every photograph, every name. They were fragments of lives protected beneath the store. The realization struck him deeply. His family had stood for something powerful, something rooted not in wealth, but in compassion. A legacy shaped by courage. He understood then why the store had always felt more important than its broken walls suggested. It had been a sanctuary, a refuge against injustice, and nothing Victor Hale had said could erase that. Daniel stood in the center of the chamber with Ranger at his side and felt a quiet resolve grow within him. The store was not just an inheritance, it was a responsibility. A torch passed down, a call to honor what had been built in secret. He climbed the steps back into the store, the weight of history pressing gently on his shoulders. Ranger followed him closely. As Daniel closed the hatch, he felt the significance of what he had discovered settle firmly in his chest. His grandfather had stood with the light. And now it was Daniel's turn to choose whether he would do the same. Night settled over Riverbend with a heavy quiet that pressed gently against the old wooden walls of the store. The sky outside was dark and moonless, and the air carried a cool dampness that hinted at distant rain. Mist drifted low along the streets, softening the shapes of buildings and giving the town an eerie stillness. Inside the store, faint shadows moved as the wind slipped through the cracks in the window frames. Daniel lay on a thin mattress he had placed near the counter, too restless to sleep in his rented room. Since discovering the underground chamber, an anxious energy had filled him. The discovery pulled at his thoughts like an unfinished sentence, urging him to stay near the store as if the past might rise again in his absence. Ranger rested at the foot of the mattress, his strong body curled but alert, his ears twitching with every faint sound. Daniel stared at the ceiling, replaying everything he had learned about his grandfather. Pride swelled in him, but so did fear. Secrets of that magnitude were never without danger. He feared what others might do if they learned what lay beneath the floor. Yet he also felt a fierce sense of responsibility. The chamber represented lives once protected, a legacy of courage built quietly through sacrifice. Letting it be destroyed felt unthinkable. A sudden growl rumbled from Ranger's throat, deep, urgent. Daniel bolted upright. Ranger stood with his head low, ears pointed sharply, eyes fixed on the front door. The growl grew louder. Daniel's pulse quickened. He rose silently and stepped toward Ranger, placing a hand on the dog's shoulder. The tension in Ranger's muscles told him everything. Someone was outside. Before Daniel could reach the door, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the room. The lock snapped, metal scraping violently as the door swung inward. Cold air swept into the store, along with the shadowed outline of an intruder. Daniel could not see the person's features, only the hurried movements and the rough silhouette of a figure dressed in dark clothing. The intruder stepped quickly inside and began scanning the room with frantic urgency. Drawers were yanked open. Boxes were overturned. Shelves rattled under rough hands. The person was searching for something, and Daniel did not need to guess what it was. They were looking for the entrance to the underground chamber. Ranger lunged forward with sudden power, his paws slamming against the floor as he charged. A barking roar filled the room. The intruder froze for a heartbeat, then stumbled backward in panic. Ranger continued forward, teeth bared in warning, but stopping just short of making contact. Daniel grabbed the back of Ranger's collar to steady him, but the message was already clear. Ranger was ready to defend. The intruder darted toward the open doorway and ran into the night. The sound of footsteps faded until only the quiet hum of the wind remained. Daniel locked the door again, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He turned toward the chaos. Shelves stood crooked. Papers covered the floor. The wooden boards above the hidden hatch bore fresh scratches as if someone had tried to pry them loose. Daniel knelt beside Ranger and exhaled slowly. Fear swirled inside him, mixed with anger. He had known the secret was dangerous, but he had not expected someone to strike so soon. Ranger pressed his head against Daniel's side, grounding him with steady warmth. Without Ranger, the intruder might have reached the hatch. The chamber might already be exposed. The next morning brought no comfort. As sunlight broke over Riverbend, Victor Hale arrived with a thin smile that carried no warmth. He walked with smooth confidence, the heels of his polished shoes tapping sharply against the wooden floor. His silver hair remained perfect, even in the wind, and his tailored suit looked more suited to a city office than a small town store. Victor addressed Daniel with a tone that balanced politeness and quiet threat. He claimed to know about the break-in, then shifted quickly to matters of business. He produced documents printed on thick, crisp paper. His voice was calm, but carried a razor edge. He spoke of legal rights and property evaluations and development plans. He warned Daniel that his refusal to sell was causing delays. He implied that the town council might view the deteriorating store as a hazard. His words were coated in charm, but were meant to corner. Daniel listened with a tightening jaw. The pressure felt suffocating. Victor spoke of lawsuits. He spoke of forced acquisition if Daniel continued to resist. He spoke as though Daniel had no choice, as though the land was already his in all but name. Ranger stood at Daniel's side, eyes fixed on Victor with unwavering suspicion. The dog's steady presence helped Daniel keep his voice firm, though his chest felt like it held a storm. When Victor finally left, Daniel sank into a chair, staring at the papers left on the counter. The numbers were tempting. The threats were real. Everything in his life had been a struggle. Poverty was a weight he had carried for years. This store could either free him or destroy him. He closed his eyes. His thoughts whirled. The memories of the underground chamber rose before him. The faces in the photographs. The letters filled with desperation and gratitude. The quiet courage of his grandfather, who had given everything to protect the vulnerable. Selling would mean abandoning that legacy. It would mean letting the light his grandfather had carried be extinguished. The thought made Daniel's stomach twist painfully. He looked at Ranger, who held his gaze with unwavering trust. Ranger had saved him once before and guided him to the truth buried beneath the store. The dog's steady presence reminded him of who he wanted to become. A man who stood for something greater than survival. A man worthy of the legacy left to him. The choice before him was clear yet terrifying. He could sell and escape poverty. Or he could stay and risk losing everything to protect the secret his grandfather had guarded. As the day waned and silence settled once more, Daniel felt the weight of the decision settle over him like a shield. He would not sell. Not now. Not after all he had learned. The cost might be great, but protecting the truth was greater still. A soft morning haze covered Riverbend as the day began. The air carried the gentle warmth of early sunlight, mixed with a cool whisper of breeze that rustled through the maple trees surrounding the old church. Shadows stretched long across the ground, giving the town a quiet and reflective mood. It was the calm before something important, something that had the weight of truth behind it. Daniel stood outside the church doors, with Ranger at his side. His hands were steady, but his chest carried a tight knot of nervous energy. He had faced danger in war and hardship in civilian life, yet speaking before the people of Riverbend filled him with a different kind of fear. It was the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of opening wounds he had kept closed, and the fear of letting down the legacy his grandfather had protected in silence. Ranger sensed the tension and pressed his head gently against Daniel's thigh. The German shepherd's warm presence offered a grounding comfort. His black and tan coat gleamed softly in the morning light. His eyes held calm strength, the kind that came from years of loyalty and instinct. To Daniel, Ranger was more than a companion. He was a reminder that courage was not found in noise, but in steady presence. Inside the church, wooden pews lined the room. People of all ages filled the seats. Their murmured conversations echoed off the high ceiling. Some held uncertainty in their expressions. Others looked curious. A few carried skepticism in their folded arms and narrowed eyes. They had heard rumors about the old store. They had seen Victor Hale's pressure tactics. They had wondered why Daniel Brooks, a quiet veteran with little money, refused a fortune. Daniel could not blame them. Riverbend was a small town where trust was built slowly and stories often traveled faster than truth. Standing near the front pew was Mary Collins, a retired schoolteacher with silver hair pulled neatly into a low bun. Her face carried soft wrinkles from years of smiling at children she had taught. Her eyes were gentle but firm, the eyes of someone who had guided generations with patient care. She wore a simple blue dress and held herself with a quiet dignity. Mary believed deeply in the value of community and in the power of truth, and she had approached Daniel with unwavering encouragement when she learned what he planned to share. Beside her stood Jonah Pierce, a local historian in his early 50s. Jonah had a lean build and thoughtful eyes behind a pair of thick glasses. His graying beard framed a face marked by long hours spent reading old records and piecing together forgotten stories. He spoke with calm precision and carried a deep respect for history. When Daniel had shown him the letters and journals from the underground chamber, Jonah had been moved nearly to tears. He understood the significance in a way few others could. Daniel stepped inside. Conversation softened. Mary offered him a reassuring nod. Jonah clasped his shoulder with a grave look that conveyed support. When Daniel reached the front of the room, he paused. His breath caught. The weight of what he was about to share settled on him fully. Ranger stood on his left side, tall and steady. The dog's presence caught the attention of the crowd. Many knew Ranger's reputation as a rescue dog who had saved Daniel in war and again during the break-in at the store. Seeing Ranger now felt like witnessing a living symbol of loyalty. Daniel drew a slow breath and began to speak. His voice started low, carrying the rough texture of a man unused to addressing groups. But as he continued, something steadier rose within him. He told the story from the beginning. The inheritance, the decaying store, the strange letter from his grandfather, Ranger's strange behavior that led him to the loose floorboard, the hatch that opened into darkness, and finally, the chamber. He spoke of the letters he found, letters filled with desperation and hope. He described the photographs of families, tired but determined. He described the journals written in his grandfather's hand, recording every person who had passed through that hidden sanctuary. People fleeing violence, people without homes, veterans like himself searching for a place where they would not be abandoned. The room grew still. Faces softened, hands clasped tightly, eyes glistened. Daniel unfolded one of the letters and read a passage aloud. His voice trembled, but did not break. He spoke of courage. He spoke of kindness offered in silence. He spoke of the purpose his grandfather had carried through decades of risk. Mary stepped forward when Daniel finished. Her voice was quiet, but full of conviction, as she spoke of the value of compassion in a world that often forgot its most vulnerable. Her gentle words wrapped around the room like a warm blanket. Jonah followed, explaining the historical significance of the chamber. He spoke clearly about how rare such places were and how deeply they reflected the moral heart of a community. He said Riverbend should be proud, not ashamed, that such a legacy had lived beneath its feet for so long. Daniel looked at the crowd. Tears traced down the cheeks of an elderly woman in the third row. A young man bowed his head. A father holding his child shook his head slowly, overcome by emotion. The silence in the room was powerful, not empty. It was filled with the realization that the old store was not a burden, not an eyesore, but a beacon of human kindness. Ranger lifted his head proudly, ears tall, as if sensing the shift in the room. When Daniel stepped away from the front, the townspeople rose from their seats. Many approached him with trembling voices to thank him for protecting the truth. Others gently touched Ranger's head in gratitude. The warmth of their reactions washed over Daniel in waves. For the first time since he returned to Riverbend, he felt that he belonged. More than that, he felt he had honored his grandfather's spirit. He walked out of the church with Ranger by his side, the morning light brighter than before. People followed behind him, carrying a renewed sense of unity. The old store was no longer seen as a forgotten building. It was a testament to compassion and courage, a piece of Riverbend's soul. And Daniel knew that whatever fight lay ahead, he would not face it alone. A pale gray morning settled over Riverbend with a calm that felt almost deceptive. A thin layer of mist drifted above the streets, softening the outlines of buildings and trees. The cool air moved gently across the town as if carrying the echoes of the gathering at the church. Riverbend was waking to a different kind of day, one shaped by truth brought into the light. Daniel stood outside the old store, with Ranger beside him. The wooden boards of the building still sagged under years of age, yet something about the place felt changed. Perhaps it was the memory of the crowd in the church, their eyes filled with emotion. Perhaps it was the knowledge that he had finally shared the truth hidden for so long. For the first time since arriving in Riverbend, Daniel felt as if he was standing on ground that recognized him. Ranger sat close, steady and quiet. The German shepherd held himself with calm strength, his black and tan coat lifting gently in the morning breeze. His presence had always been a source of comfort for Daniel, but now it meant more. The people of Riverbend had seen Ranger as part of the story. They had seen him protect Daniel during the break-in. They had seen him stand by Daniel during the gathering. Ranger had become a symbol of loyalty and courage. Within days, the story spread far beyond Riverbend. News articles appeared online with detailed accounts of the hidden chamber discovered beneath the old store. Pictures of the letters, journals, and fading photographs traveled across social networks. Reporters arrived in town carrying cameras and notebooks. They spoke to Daniel with respectful curiosity, their voices lowered when they discussed his grandfather. They marveled at the quiet bravery that had shaped generations. Not long after, organizations dedicated to historical preservation began contacting the town. Some focused on the protection of old architecture. Others specialized in documenting stories of humanitarian acts. A few were groups linked to human rights advocacy. They all carried the same message. The store and its secret chamber held significant value for the nation's cultural memory. It deserved recognition. Riverbend felt the shift. The town was small and had struggled for years with dwindling jobs and limited resources. There had been disagreements over development, especially regarding Stone River's planned expansion. Many residents had seen the old store as an obstacle. Now they saw it as a beacon. The town council arranged for a petition. Residents visited the community center, forming long lines to add their names. Elderly couples who had lived in Riverbend all their lives came forward with trembling hands. Young parents carried their children in their arms while signing. Teenagers who had recently learned of the store's history wrote their names with fierce pride. Within days, the petition gathered thousands of signatures, not just from Riverbend, but from surrounding towns. Word continued to spread, and more names were added each hour. Daniel watched the movement grow with quiet wonder. He had spent much of his adult life in silence, believing his voice had little weight. Now, he stood at the center of something larger than himself. Yet with that feeling came a sense of humility. He had not created this legacy. He had simply uncovered it. The true strength belonged to his grandfather and to the many souls who had once sought refuge beneath the store. There were moments when Daniel felt the pressure of attention tightening around him. He had never liked the spotlight. He preferred working quietly with Ranger at his side. But whenever the weight felt too heavy, Ranger nudged his leg or pressed his head against Daniel's palm. The dog reminded him that courage was not found in comfort, but in choosing to stand firm. Stone River Real Estate reacted quickly to the growing resistance. Their representatives released statements calling the store a hazard and claiming that the chamber beneath it was unsafe. They warned that Riverbend was making a mistake by resisting development. Yet the louder they argued, the more the people pushed back. The community had found something worth protecting, and no amount of pressure could undo that. Some reporters approached Victor Hale for statements. Those who met him described a man who held himself stiffly, with silver hair perfectly controlled and eyes that revealed little emotion. He spoke with rehearsed confidence, insisting that progress could not be halted for the sake of nostalgia. But the tone of the town had changed. His words no longer carried influence. Amid all of this, Daniel continued to work on the store. He cleared broken shelves. He sorted through boxes. He swept the floors with slow, steady movements. The work helped him manage the anxiety that came with uncertainty. Every piece of dust removed felt like a small step toward honoring the past. Ranger often remained beside him, watching the front door as if guarding the threshold. Despite the rising support, Daniel still lived in modest conditions. Money remained tight. The offer from Stone River had tempted him once, but that temptation was gone now. The purpose he felt was stronger than the hardship. Even when nights grew cold and meals remained simple, Daniel carried a quiet pride. He knew he had finally chosen a path that aligned with his heart. People in the town often stopped him on the street. They offered warm words, homemade food, or simple gestures of gratitude. Some thanked him for protecting their history. Others thanked him for reminding them of the goodness that had once lived among them through his grandfather. Many knelt to pet Ranger, who accepted their affection calmly, his tail wagging with dignified grace. One afternoon, a group of local children stood outside the store. They asked if they could see Ranger. Their small faces lit up when he trotted toward them. They called him the guardian of the secret doorway. Daniel watched with a soft ache in his chest. Ranger had become more than a dog to the town. He had become a symbol of courage that people could touch. As petitions filled, newspapers printed articles, and organizations offered support, Daniel felt something within him settle with peaceful certainty. The path ahead was still uncertain. Stone River would not give up easily, but he no longer felt alone. Riverbend had risen around him. The voices that once whispered doubts now spoke with clarity and conviction. Standing outside the old store, as the evening sun cast long shadows across the street, Daniel placed a hand on Ranger's back. The dog leaned into him with steady confidence. Together, they looked toward the town that had chosen to stand with them. Daniel felt the quiet truth settle deep within him. He had done what was right, and now the people of Riverbend were doing the same. Morning sunlight washed gently over Riverbend as the first warmth of the day settled onto the rooftops. The sky carried a soft gold tint that brightened slowly, touching the streets and the trees with the calm promise of renewal. The air was still cool, holding the faint scent of dew and wood smoke. It felt like the beginning of something quietly hopeful, a day shaped by the long journey that had brought the town and Daniel to this moment. Daniel stood before the old store, with Ranger close beside him. Only now, it no longer looked like a forgotten relic. The building had been carefully restored, its wooden boards cleaned and reinforced, its windows repaired, its sign polished until the faded letters shone with humble dignity. It still carried the marks of age, but those marks had become part of its story. The same building that once sagged with abandonment now stood proud as the Riverbend Memorial Center. Daniel felt a deep sense of awe as he looked at it. Months earlier, he had stepped into this place, feeling like a lost man, burdened by memories of war and uncertainty. Now he stood as someone who had helped carry forward a legacy larger than himself. The recognition of the store as a historical site had brought grants from preservation groups and support from the community. A foundation had been created to protect the property and to honor the history hidden beneath it. The once abandoned store now lived with purpose again. Inside, sunlight streamed through newly cleaned windows and cast gentle light on the displays. The main room had been turned into a small museum. Letters and journals from the underground chamber were carefully framed behind glass. Old photographs showed faces of those who had passed through seeking refuge. Each artifact was placed with care, surrounded by quiet respect. The air inside carried a sense of stillness and gratitude. Daniel walked through the space with measured steps. He had been offered the position of manager for the center, a role that provided him with steady income and a sense of belonging. It felt strange at first. He had become used to scraping by at the lumber mill, working long hours and feeling lost in routine. Now his work was tied to meaning, tied to something gentle and enduring. The shift filled him with both humility and relief. As he moved through the hall, Ranger padded beside him. The German shepherd walked with a confident gait, tail held calmly behind him. His black and tan coat gleamed in the soft indoor lights. Ranger had become known by the people of Riverbend as the guardian of the store. Children called him the guide of the hidden door. Visitors often asked if he would lead them into the underground chamber. Ranger accepted the attention with patient dignity, pausing for gentle pets and moving with quiet grace through the restored space. Daniel reached the back of the building, where a staircase now led down to the preserved chamber. New lighting had been installed along the stone walls, casting warm illumination across the underground room. The space felt both ancient and alive. Wooden benches had been added for visitors. Information panels explained the story of the people who had found refuge here decades ago. The same journals and letters that Daniel once held in trembling hands were now displayed in protective cases. Ranger stepped onto the first stair and looked back at Daniel as if waiting for permission. Daniel smiled softly and followed him. Every time he descended these steps, he felt the weight of what had happened here, but that weight no longer wounded him. It grounded him. It reminded him that healing was possible when courage met compassion. When they reached the chamber floor, Daniel paused. He could hear faint footsteps of early visitors in the room above. Soon, the center would open for the day. People from across the state would walk through and learn about the history of Riverbend and the legacy of those who had once lived in the shadows. Some came seeking understanding. Others came seeking hope. Daniel understood both kinds of visitors, for he had once been searching too. As he looked at the displays, his thoughts drifted to his grandfather. He imagined the older man moving through this room quietly, carrying lanterns and blankets for people who needed shelter. He imagined the sound of hushed conversations, the tremble of fear, the sighs of relief. The underground chamber had once been a lifeline. Now it was a memorial. Both carried a kind of sacredness. When Daniel returned to the main floor, he found Mary Collins speaking with a small group of visitors near the entrance. Mary wore her familiar soft-colored dress and cardigan. Her silver hair was pulled neatly back. She greeted each visitor with warmth and patience, her gentle voice offering context and encouragement. She had become one of the volunteers who helped guide guests through the center. Daniel valued her presence. She carried grace with her wherever she went. Jonah Pierce stood nearby, reviewing a set of documents for an upcoming exhibition. His glasses sat slightly crooked on his nose, his beard trimmed neatly. Jonah had taken on the role of historical advisor for the center. His knowledge shaped many of the descriptions and displays. Daniel appreciated the calm seriousness he brought to the work. Daniel stepped outside with Ranger. The morning sun had risen enough to warm the boards of the porch. People began to approach, ready for the day's opening. Their faces held a mix of curiosity and respect. Some waved to Daniel. Others knelt to greet Ranger. Daniel answered with quiet nods, his heart filled with something gentle. The hardships had not vanished. He still carried memories of the battlefield. He still felt the ache of the nights he spent alone before Ranger found him in combat and refused to leave his side. He still lived with scars that did not fade. But now, those scars had a place to rest. The work he did at the center gave him purpose. The people around him gave him community. Ranger gave him steady companionship. The building behind him stood as a sign that the past had been seen and honored. And Daniel, for the first time in years, felt that he had stepped into a home he could grow in. He looked down at Ranger, who lifted his head proudly. Together, they faced the town that had helped them heal. The sun warmed Daniel's face. A soft breeze passed over the porch. The day ahead held work and visitors and conversations that carried meaning. Daniel breathed deeply. He had found his purpose again, and it extended far beyond himself. In the end, the story of Daniel and Ranger reminds us that even the quiet corners of the world can hold miracles waiting to be found. A broken building became a place of healing. A wounded soldier found purpose again. A loyal German shepherd became a symbol of hope. And one small town rediscovered the strength of community by choosing compassion over fear. Their journey shows that every act of kindness carries a light that can guide others through darkness. It tells us that no life is too shattered to be rebuilt when love and courage walk beside it. As you return to your daily life, may you remember that God often works through ordinary hands and simple moments. His grace appears gently, like a doorway opening when you thought all paths were closed. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who needs encouragement, to leave a comment about where you see hope in your own life, and to subscribe so we can continue walking this path together. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones, and may His peace guide you today and always.